Hello viewer, welcome back. So you know how there can be that kind of uncomfortable moment for parents where their kids might ask them, hey mom and dad, where do babies come from? Well, for cryptographers, the uncomfortable moment is when the students ask them, hey, where do keys come from? And so today we're going to try to lift the cover a little bit off that difficult question and see what's going on underneath. So to recall what the issue is, remember that we've studied a few settings. One of them is the public key setting. And the way we studied it was to assume that a key generation process had produced a public key and associated secret key for one of the entities, call that entity B, and that the other entity A was in possession of B's public key, which we write as giving that public key as a superscript. Once that is in place, all the different nice primitives that we defined and designed can come into play. For example, A can encrypt under B's public key a message M and send the ciphertext to B, and B can then decrypt it using the secret key associated to its public key, recover the message. And this will provide privacy in various forms like INDCPA, INDCCA. Correspondingly, B could sign a message M using its secret key to generate a signature. And then if A receives the message and signature, it can verify that the signature is correct using the public key of B associated to the secret key, which produced the signature. And we studied how to build signature schemes that satisfy UFCMA. Our question now, however, is not about how these are done, we know that, but just about how does A actually obtain B's public key. Before we get further into that, we may want to ask a little bit, who or what exactly are A and B? Well, there are of course many different possibilities, but most commonly B is a server, for example a TLS server, and it has an identity which might be a domain name or IP address. For example, B equals google.com or amazon.com or any one of the numerous websites that we often visit. And we will kind of identify B with that identity. Similarly, A is also an IP address and is usually viewed as the client in these questions. Okay, now let's get back to how A gets B's public key. And of course, at first glance, that seems extremely simple. We certainly know how B can generate keys. It does that itself locally by running one of the prescribed key generation algorithms. This could be RSA keygen or Diffie-Hellman discrete log type keys or whatever. That will give it the keys, both of them, and then it can just contact A and say, hi, I'm B, here's my identity, here's my public key, and we should be done. Of course, we're not, and the reason is that there's no authenticity there. A has no guarantee that it's actually B, the correct identity claimed in the flow, who is associated to the public key that's placed there. So in particular, there's something called the entity in the middle attack, where the adversary E simply steps in between A and B. In fact, B doesn't even appear in this picture. The adversary simply runs the key generation algorithm. It can do that. The algorithm is completely public, and it gets keys. Of course, these are not the same as B's keys. They're completely different. They're the adversary's keys. But if it contacts A and says, here's this public key, and oh, by the way, I'm B, well, A has no way to know that this isn't true. So A will now adopt PKE as B's public key. Now, if we start using the keys in the way we've looked at before, A will start encrypting messages under this public key, assuming that B can decrypt. But of course, B is nowhere in the picture, and actually the adversary E can decrypt any ciphertext transmitted. Similarly, the adversary can now get A to accept signatures, and A will do so thinking that B has signed this message. but in fact, of course, the adversary signed it. So this isn't really at all what we're looking for. So we now have a clearer sense of the goal. It's not merely to convey B's public key to A, but to do so with authenticity so that A is assured that it has an authentic copy of B's public key. And there is some kind of proof to that effect. The most popular way to do this is through what's called the Public Key Infrastructure, or PKI. And in that solution, there is an entity called a certificate authority that enters. It's a trusted entity, and its job is to provide this proof that a key that B claims to be its really is its. And what we call the certificate is the proof that's provided. Now, while this is the main internet and TLS way to reach the goal of getting authentic public keys communicated, it's of course not the only one. Other things you might do is B could simply post its public key somewhere. For example, its Facebook page or a personal or corporate web page. Sometimes people include public keys as attachments in their email. There are also systems like OpenPGP, which have key servers, and you can look up people's keys there. If you meet A, you might hand them your key in person, and so forth. But with that done, we're going to look a little more closely at PKI and certificates. Certificate authorities are out there. Let's Encrypt is one of the popular ones. It's a free certificate authority which you can use to get TLS certificates, and quite easy to use. There are many others. You can find different names out there and information about the fraction of usage that they have in the market share and things like that. So how does the certificate process work? First of all, B does generate itself locally its public key and secret key. This does not involve the certificate authority or any other entity, and as a result of this, B is the only one who knows its own secret key. Once B has done this, it contacts the certificate authority and says, "Hi, I'm B, here's my identity, my IP address or whatever, and here's the public key I claim I would like to be bound to that identity. And can you please go ahead and do this binding?" The certificate authority's job is to perform an identity check to ensure that this public key really belongs to the identity that claims it. In other words, if B is claiming a public key for example.com, is B entitled to do that? Is that a domain it actually owns, and so forth? Other steps might include that B proves that it knows the secret key corresponding to that public key to the certificate authority. Of course, it must do this without actually revealing the secret key. Once the CA is convinced that B does have a right to claim it's that identity, it agrees to bind PK to that identity, and it does that by issuing a certificate. This certificate as a proof is sent back to B. Now when B wants to contact A and say, "Here's my public key," it sends it not the public key, but in fact the certificate, which contains the public key inside it, which A can extract. And A will verify this certificate and check that, yes, the CA, who is trusted by A, has endorsed this public key as belonging to the identity of B. So that's the high level. We can look a little bit more at different steps. So if you want to do some key generation, it's quite easy. You can do this on your system through various open source and popular algorithms. So you can run, for example, OpenSSL and tell it you want to generate an RSA key, give it the name of a file in which to put the key, and tell it a bit length. I want a 2048-bit modulus. And it'll go ahead and generate a key, and it'll tell you that the encryption exponent is kind of this default value that we've seen before, and all that will be stuck in your file. So now you have some keys there. You can then extract that public key from the key pair. So if you run this operation, it will put in this file just the public key. because that's the thing you want to send to the CA. You could also generate elliptic curve keys. So if you want to generate an elliptic curve key of size 256, you run OpenSSL with some name which tells them what the curve is. And again, it'll put everything in a file for you, and you can extract out the public key. So B can easily generate keys in that way. Now, the next part, it's sent its identity and this key to the CA. This identity could be a domain name, IP address, email address, whatever. And the CA will now, upon receiving that, check that indeed the identity that B claims is something to which it's entitled, and that this public key really belongs to that identity and not someone else. There are many ways of doing that. So a popular one is that B is a domain name, for example, example.com or something like that, in which case the certificate authority will send B a challenge and check that it can put it on the web page, and then it'll access the web page and check that that challenge is present. So B is proving it has access to that web page and thus is entitled to take that domain name as its identity. Possibly the identity is an email address, and possibly the CA could send an email to the address with a link. And so by clicking on that link, B is showing that it has access to that email address and thus that it owns it. You might even contemplate physical means. Maybe the CA has a means to check B's passport or driver's license, taking here the identity to be an individual one. And then perhaps the CA will have this proof of knowledge of secret key performed, where it'll tell B, please either sign something or decrypt something that I send you under the secret key associated to this public key to make sure that you prove that you know what the secret key is. And this is to ensure that B hasn't copied someone else's public key. And it also turns up in a few usages of cryptography and protocols. So we could look, for example, at Let's Encrypt. So here's the main web page. As you can see, they're very popular. It's a non-profit CA, and it's already provided certificates to hundreds of millions of websites. You can look at some more details on their webpage about how it works, and you see the scenario in which the web server admin of the domain name requesting a certificate will send over the name of the domain for which it wants the cert, and of course the public key and so forth. And Let's Encrypt will tell them, here, put this check or this phrase on this URL at your domain, and also sign some challenge I give you. And then it checks the signature and it goes to example.com and sees that all that is present. And then it'll agree that, yes, you own that domain name. Once the CA is convinced, as we saw above, that B owns that domain name and that it has a right to that public, to claim that, and it now says, I want to associate this public key to this identity, and it does that by forming what's called a certificate. So there'll be a certificate associated to B, and it'll have two components. One is data about the certificate, and the other is a proof created by the CA saying, yes, I have validated this. And what is that? Well, it's a digital signature. The CA itself has a public key and associated secret key. And using one of the many signature schemes we studied, it will create a signature on this and include it over here. Now, what is there inside this cert data? Well, it depends on the type of certificates and usage, but things that are fairly typical are, of course, the public key itself. This is where a recipient will extract it. Information about it. Is it an RSA key, an elliptic curve key? What is the modulus size or group size and so forth? What is the identity of the party? Who is the CA that's issued this? CAs do come with expiry dates and so forth. And there are standards like X509 for these types of things. Once the certificate is created, it's returned to the requester B. It's B's job to disseminate it further. So when B wants to disseminate it, say to A, it's going to send that cert to A, and A is then going to perform various checks and after that extract from it the public key of B. So first off, it parses the certificate into the data and the signature, and then it verifies the signature. It does this using the public key of the certificate authority and the prescribed verification algorithm of whatever digital signature scheme is being used for this process. Once that verification has passed, it extracts from the data all that's inside, and that'll give it the public key of B, the identity, expiry date, and so forth. It should check that the certificate hasn't actually expired, and also it should check that B is in fact the identity that it wants to connect to. So for example, if you want to connect to google.com, don't expect a certificate in which the identity is something different from that. Otherwise, of course, anyone can fool you into connecting to them. If all is well, then A accepts the cert and is ready to use the public key. Now, one question here is, in order to verify the CA's signature on the certificate, A, not B, needs to get the public key of the CA. And how does it do that? At first, this sounds like a cyclic sort of chicken and egg problem. Our whole question here is, how do we disseminate public keys in a trustworthy, authentic way? And here I'm assuming it has already been done. So what's going on? Well, in fact, we do a trusted dissemination of this public key of the certificate authority by embedding it in software, such as your browser, if you look on popular browsers, or if you're on an Apple machine, it's in the keychain and places like that. And the idea is that there are not too many such keys, and thereby the infrastructure, public infrastructure, is going to be capable of making sure that the trusted ones are obtainable in this way. Now, one of the elements that is present in usage and is also related to this issue of dissemination of the certificate authority's keys is that we organize CAs into hierarchies, which is a convenient way to make certification a little easier. Now, as a not realistic but a kind of imaginative example, suppose I as a person want a certificate. I might contact a CA corresponding to UCSD where I work, who would then issue me a certificate that I could write this way. It's a cert issued by this CA for this entity. And that means it contains data, my public key, and so forth, as here. But it also contains a signature under the secret key of that CA on all that data. Now think about it from the point of view of someone to whom I send this cert. They need to verify the signature of CA UCSD. But how do they do that? To do that, they need the public key of this CA. That will be provided as part of a second cert. So this entity here now becomes the subject or the object for whom the cert is issued. And some other higher level entity, say associated to the city of San Diego, has a CA who has created this cert and whose signature has authenticated that search. And so it goes on. We now need this CA's public key to perform verification, but that's not given directly. It's embedded in a cert for that entity, which itself is validated and signed by a yet higher level cert, until we reach some highest level of all. The result of this is that if someone wants to verify my cert, they would have this entire chain and they would verify all the certs, and importantly, the only public key they would actually need embedded in their browsers and that they need to trust outside of this PKI process is the public key of the highest level authority, which we call the root. So this root public key is the one that will be in your browser or in your Apple keychain. So why might we use these hierarchies? They're convenient for a number of reasons. You might imagine, for example, that identity checking is easier for entities that know me personally, like UCSD, and thereby it's easier for them to issue a cert. But also it spreads the work out. So the job of identity checking and creation of certificates is now spread out over lots of CAs. And most importantly, by having the notion of a root CA as being the only one whose public key needs to come embedded in your browser, you can reduce the number of public keys that play that role and make that part simpler. So you can look at certificates in many places. If you have Internet Explorer or something, you can go under security and pop them up. On the Mac, they come in the keychain. So here, for example, I went into keychain on my Mac and clicked on that, and I pulled up a certificate. It's issued by author. It's issued by something called In-Common RSA Server CA. That's the name of the CA. It's a certificate for auth.ucsd.edu, which is something at UC Santa Barbara where I was visiting for a conference, and it allows me to use the wireless. So you see here all the details about the entity to whom it's issued, by whom it's issued, and so forth. You can then look in more detail inside a certificate, and you'll see, for example, the address of different of the entity to whom it's issued. This one is auth.ucsd.edu. It's a certificate here, so we see the UCSD address. You see information about the CA, what their address is. You see what signature algorithm has been used to sign the certificate, and you see the actual signature, the public key, the exponent, the size of the key. It's an RSA certificate, and you see expiry dates. It's not valid after April 19th, 2020. So it's just expired. Okay, now already certificates have some degree of complexity, but something that makes it even more so is revocation. That happens when, for various reasons, B, who has a valid certificate, decides that it needs to revoke it and stop use of that certificate. Perhaps that happened because B's secret key corresponding to the public key in the certificate was compromised. Maybe B clicked on a phishing link or something like that, or there was a infiltration to B's system and they lost their secret key. So how does B revoke its certificate? Well, it has to go back to the CA and say, please revoke this. And it'll send such a revocation request, which will be signed under the current secret key. This is to make sure that someone else can't go and revoke B's certificate. So the CA will verify the signature and make sure that the revocation request actually comes from B, and then put the certificate on what's called a revocation list. The CRL, or certificate revocation list, contains different certificates that the CA has revoked together with revocation dates. And then this list has to be disseminated. So somehow people who might be using B's certificate have to acquire that list. And if some entity A is desiring to use B's certificate, it now has an additional check. It must check that that certificate is not on the certificate revocation list. And there are many ways of doing these kinds of checks. One of them is that somehow the list is disseminated, but the other is what's called the online certificate status protocol, where A will actually contact some server and ask whether the certificate is on the certificate revocation list. So this is involves some issues. One of them is a time lag. So for example, there may be a few days in between the date that B's key is compromised and the date that B discovers that and revokes the certificate, and yet further before A actually sees the certificate revocation list. And this creates an interval in which an adversary that acquired B's key might be able to cause some damage. On the more practical side, these certificate revocation lists can get large and difficult to handle and disseminate. And so in practice, revocation is actually quite a difficult issue. This has led to alternatives as something called certificate transparency. And the idea is to create what are called transparency logs. So we could look a little bit at that. So various entities have come together and created what they call this transparency ecosystem, where certificates are deposited in public transparent logs. So what are these logs? They're append-only ledgers of certificates. They're distributed and independent. So anyone can query them to see what certificates have been included and when. And because the logs are append-only, they're verifiable by monitors. And so these monitors will check that fraudulent certificates haven't been issued. For example, somebody just creating a google.com certificate who isn't actually google.com. And as mentioned earlier, there are alternative ways to disseminate public keys which don't rely on certificates. So here, for example, is the Open PGP Key Server. And what you can do there, and we can go there as well, is that you can just check whether someone with whom you're interested in communicating has a secret key or not. So for example, I might try Professor Dan Steffen, who works in our department, and see if he has a key. And it tells me, yeah, there are some keys for Dan. This one is associated to a Stanford email. This is associated to some other email, and so forth. Not everyone will have keys. Could try myself. And we see a key, which is not mine. So there are name collisions, and some other Mihir Belare has a key. At least I hope that's the intention. We could see whether our current president has a key. Nothing there. So I guess that would be problematic. What if I tried Joe Biden? I see a lot of keys, weird ones. I cheated my way into the Oval Office. So I'm not sure what's going on there. This is obviously not the current president. Some games going on. Fun stuff, certificates.